All right, y'all, let's go ahead and talk about two more key features. We're going to talk about the domain and the range on a graph. And we're going to start by looking at this problem about John and Alice on a hiking trip. And during the last day, their parents watch their location so they know approximately when they will be home. So let's go ahead and define the idea of what the domain is. First of all, the domain are the X values, okay? The X values that produce graph. Okay, so the X values that are going to produce graph. Okay, a lot of times we talk about the domain as the inputs. Okay, and then we separate the domain, the X values, from the range, simply the Y values on the graph. Okay, so the Y values are on the graph, and those are our outputs. Okay, so we can follow this graph and say, okay, well, they start here. And you can see we're modeling John and Alice's hiking trip as they get closer and closer to home. So they follow down and they get closer and closer to home, and then they go constant, and then they go further away from home, and then they stay about the same distance from home, and then eventually they start working their way until they get to home. So what is the domain and what is the range? So the domain has to deal with the X values. Okay, so the domains have to deal with the X values, and the X values are down here. We can find those right here and here. And between the domain, we would say between 0 and 20 hours, they are traveling home. And we can see that it means hours down here. So between 0 and 20, you can see that they were traveling home the entire time. So we would write our domain by saying, okay, we started at 0 hours. We followed them until we got to 20 hours. And at 20 hours, they got home. And that's how we would write their domain. And you can see that there's graph above the entire time. So for every one of those inputs that are producing parts of the graph, each one of those X values are doing that. And so that is how we would write our domain. Now, the next part we'd go to is the range. Well, what are our Y values? And you might see that now. Our Y values represent the miles. And we know that they started 26 miles away and they end up 0 miles away from home because they're going to end up at home. So what are the range values? Well, they started at 26 and they work their way home until they are 0 miles away from home. And you can see that if we just follow the graph, the same way we did it before. They started at 26 and then they just start working their way until they get all the way home. So how would we say that? Well, what are their Y values, or all the Y values that are on the graph? We would just simply say, we start at 0, we start with the lower. They will eventually be home, so it's equal to. We're talking about the Y values because it's the range, okay? And then they were at most 26 miles away on that day. And that is the range and the Y values as we work from 26 all the way down to 0. And for each time there is graph or Y values all the way down to that point. All right, I hope that helps you understand how we write a domain for the X values and the range with the Y values.